The sky is screaming. That's the only way to describe it. A sound so violent, so utterly consuming that it drowns out the roar of your aircraft's engines, the hammering of your own heart, the prayers you're whispering under your oxygen mask. Black puffs of smoke materialize around your bomber like deadly flowers blooming in midair, each one marking a spot where a shell just exploded with enough force to tear a B-17 flying fortress into scrap metal. The flak is so thick you could almost walk on it. Your aircraft shudders with each near miss, metal groaning, rivets straining. Through the plexiglass nose, you can see the other bombers in your formation. 23 came with you over the target, but already 3 are falling, trailing smoke and fire, spinning toward the Earth 10,000 feet below. You're a bombardier in the 8th Air Force, 22 years old, and you're flying through what might be the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire in human history. The year is 1944, and somewhere below those clouds is an oil refinery that keeps the Nazi war machine running. Your job is to destroy it. The job of those guns below, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, is to kill you first. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will show you exactly why American airmen called these missions running the gauntlet, and why their courage in the face of the deadliest defenses ever created would help win the war. To understand what made World War II's anti-aircraft defenses so lethal, you have to understand what was at stake. By 1943, the Allied strategic bombing campaign had become Nazi Germany's worst nightmare. American B-17s and B-24s flew by day, British Lancasters and Halifaxes by night, raining destruction on factories, refineries, rail yards, and cities across occupied Europe and the German heartland. These bombers threatened to strangle the Third Reich's war production, to break the will of the German people, to make it impossible for Hitler's armies to continue fighting. So the Germans responded with the most sophisticated, deadly, and comprehensive air defense network the world had ever seen. They called it the Luftverteidigung, air defense, but that clinical term doesn't capture the reality of what they built. Imagine a killing field that stretched across entire countries, a zone of death that extended from the ground to 40,000 feet, bristling with weapons specifically designed to swat aircraft from the sky. Thousands upon thousands of anti-aircraft guns, from small rapid-fire cannons to massive 128mm monsters that could hurl a 30-pound shell 6 miles into the air. Radar systems that could track bomber formations 100 miles away. Searchlights that turn night into day, penning bombers in cones of brilliant light while the flak guns zeroed in. And backing it all up, squadrons of German fighters, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, ready to pounce on any bomber that survived the flak. The deadliest element of this defense network was something called Flak, short for Fliegerabwehrkanone, or Aircraft Defense Pannen in German. The most common and feared was the 88mm Flak gun, a weapon so effective it became legendary on both sides. The 88 could fire a 20-pound high-explosive shell to an altitude of nearly 30,000 feet, and it could do it with terrifying accuracy thanks to sophisticated fire control systems that calculated range, altitude, and aircraft speed. When that shell exploded, it sent red-hot shrapnel in every direction, creating a killing radius of nearly 200 feet. But here's what made it truly deadly. The Germans didn't deploy these guns individually. They grouped them in batteries of 4, 6, sometimes 12 guns working together, all controlled by a central fire director using radar and optical rangefinders. When a bomber formation approached, these batteries would create a box barrage, filling a specific section of sky with exploding shells timed to detonate at the exact altitude where the bombers would be. Flying through a box barrage was like flying through a hurricane made of shrapnel and explosive force. Around high-value targets, oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, submarine pens, major cities, the Germans concentrated these batteries into flak corridors and flak alleys. Some targets were defended by more than 1,000 anti-aircraft guns. The city of Berlin alone had 3,000. The Romanian oil fields at Ploesti, which supplied much of Germany's fuel, were protected by what Allied intelligence called the most heavily defended target in Europe, a nightmare of interlocking gun positions, barrage balloons, smoke generators, and fighter bases. American bomber crews developed their own vocabulary for these defenses. Light flak was the small-caliber guns, 20 mil and 37 mil, that created streams of glowing tracers, beautiful and deadly, reaching up like deadly fingers trying to pluck you from the sky. Medium flak was the 88s and 105s, creating those black smoke puffs that marked where death had just visited. Heavy flak was the big guns, 128mm monsters that shook your aircraft even when they missed, that could kill you from a quarter-mile away with sheer concussive force. Would you have had the courage to fly into that? To climb into your aircraft knowing that hundreds of guns would be waiting, that the odds were against you coming home, but doing it anyway because the mission mattered more than the fear? The statistics tell a story of almost unimaginable danger. In 1943 and 1944, the worst years of the strategic bombing campaign, American bomber crews in Europe had roughly a 1 in 4 chance of completing their required 25 missions. Not 1 in 4 chance of dying, 1 in 4 chance of making it through their tour alive and unwounded. The rest would be killed, captured, or maimed. Anti-aircraft fire accounted for more bomber losses than German fighters. In some raids, particularly those against heavily defended industrial targets, loss rates exceeded 20%. That means 1 in 5 aircraft that took off didn't come home. Let me put that in perspective. If you were assigned to a bomber crew in 1943, you were more likely to become a casualty than an infantry soldier landing on D-Day. And unlike the infantry, who could dig in, take cover, or retreat if things got too hot, bomber crews had no options. Once you were committed to the bomb run, you had to fly straight and level for several minutes while the bombardier lined up the target. No evasive maneuvers, no dodging, just flying through that hurricane of fire and steel, holding formation, waiting for the moment when you could finally release your bombs and get the hell out of there. The raid on Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, showed just how deadly these defenses could be. Schweinfurt was home to Germany's ball-bearing plants, and destroying them could cripple Nazi war production. The target was deep inside Germany, beyond the range of fighter escorts. 291 B-17s of the 8th Air Force took off that morning, fully aware they'd be on their own against the Luftwaffe and the Flak batteries. The mission was a disaster. German fighters hit the formation repeatedly during the long flight into Germany, but it was the flak over Schweinfurt itself that proved most devastating. The city was ringed with 88mm batteries that created a wall of exploding steel. Bomber after bomber took hits. Engines shot out, wings torn off, fuselages ripped open. 60 B-17s were shot down. 17 more were so badly damaged they'd never fly again. Nearly 600 American airmen were killed or captured in a single mission. The 8th Air Force called it Black Thursday, and the losses were so severe that deep penetration raids into Germany had to be suspended until long-range fighter escorts became available. But even with fighter protection, the flak remained deadly. The invasion of Europe required taking out the German oil industry, which meant repeated raids on refineries and synthetic fuel plants. These were the most heavily defended targets in the Reich, and the losses were staggering. The raid on Merseburg-Luna on November 2, 1944, saw 29 bombers shot down by flak alone. The mission to Politz on April 10, 1945, just weeks before the war ended, cost the 8th Air Force another 33 aircraft to anti-aircraft fire. The men who flew these missions were volunteers, every single one. America didn't draft bomber crews, they stepped forward, knowing the odds, choosing to serve anyway. Most were barely old enough to vote, but they were entrusted with aircraft costing $200,000 each, loaded with 5,000 pounds of high explosives and enough ammunition to fight off a squadron of fighters. They flew in conditions that were literally freezing, 50 below zero at altitude, where a moment's carelessness could give you frostbite severe enough to lose fingers or toes. They wore heated flight suits that sometimes malfunctioned and burned them. They breathed through oxygen masks that could freeze and suffocate them. And they did it mission after mission, climbing back into their aircraft even after watching friends die, even after seeing their own aircraft shot to pieces around them. The crew of the Memphis Belle became famous as the first B-17 crew to complete 25 missions over Europe. But their fame came from doing something that was statistically unlikely to the point of near impossibility. They flew through the Flak over some of the most heavily defended targets in Europe and survived through a combination of skill, luck, and the sheer determination not to let their fellow crew members down. Each mission followed a similar pattern of tension. You'd wake before dawn at your base in England, eat a breakfast you could barely taste because your stomach was already tight with anticipation. The briefing would reveal the target, and experienced crews could judge how bad it would be by the reactions around the room. Targets in the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, so heavily defended it was called Flak Valley. The synthetic oil plants, the submarine pens, the groans and curses told you everything you needed to know. Then the wait while your aircraft was prepared, while mechanics loaded the bombs and filled the fuel tanks and armed the guns. The crew chief would walk around with you, this sergeant who'd been keeping your aircraft flying, pointing out patches where flak damage had been repaired, showing you the new engine installed after the last one took a direct hit. He'd wish you luck, and you could see in his eyes that he'd be counting aircraft when you returned, hoping yours would be among them. Could anyone else have faced these odds with such resolve? Could any other nation's airmen have sustained such losses and kept flying, kept fighting, never giving up? The takeoff in darkness, or pre-dawn light, 30 or 40 aircraft from your base alone, joining with other groups until the sky was filled with hundreds of bombers forming up into the combat boxes that gave you the best chance of survival. Tight formations where every aircraft's guns covered the others, where the sheer mass of firepower could beat off fighter attacks. The climb to altitude, watching the English countryside fall away, then the Channel, then the coast of occupied Europe sliding beneath you. The fighter escorts would meet you at the enemy coast, first P-47 Thunderbolts with their limited range, then later in the war, the P-51 Mustangs that could go all the way to Berlin and back. You'd see them weaving above and around your formation, looking for German fighters, and their presence gave you confidence. But they couldn't do anything about the flak. When those black puffs started appearing around your formation, you were on your own. The first bursts would be ranging shots, the German gun crews adjusting their aim. Then the barrage would intensify as you approached the target. The aircraft would start to buck and shudder from near misses. You'd hear metal pinging and tearing as shrapnel ripped through the fuselage. Sometimes you'd see daylight suddenly appear where there'd been solid aluminum a moment before. Sometimes you'd smell smoke or see fire starting somewhere in the aircraft, and your mind would race through the emergency procedures even as you stayed at your station, doing your job. The pilot and co-pilot would be fighting the controls, trying to hold the aircraft steady in the face of concussive blasts that felt like getting punched by an invisible giant. The bombardier would be hunched over the Norden bomb site, making tiny adjustments, watching the target crawl toward the crosshairs while flak burst all around. The navigator would be checking and rechecking the position, making sure you were on course, that these risks were being taken for the right target. The aircraft engineer would be monitoring gauges, managing fuel, watching for damage. The radio operator would be listening for recalls or changes to the mission, passing information between crew positions. And the gunners, waist gunner, tail gunner, ball turret gunner, would be scanning the sky for fighters, ready to add their fire to the defensive screen if German Messerschmitts dove through the flak toward your formation. The bomb run seemed to last forever. In reality, it was maybe 5 minutes, sometimes less, but when every second brings the possibility of a shell with your name on it, time distorts. You'd see other aircraft in your formation taking hits, an engine catching fire, a wing folding up, the horrible sight of a B-17 simply exploding in midair when a shell hit the bomb bay before the bombs could be released. You'd see parachutes blooming, counting them, knowing that a B-17 carried 10 men and hoping to see 10 chutes, but rarely counting that many. Then finally, bombs away, and you'd feel the aircraft suddenly lift as 5,000 pounds of bombs dropped toward the target. The formation would begin a slow, careful turn away from the target zone, picking up speed, getting out of the flak zone as quickly as possible while maintaining enough formation integrity to defend against fighters. You'd check in with your crew members, making sure everyone was okay, assessing damage, deciding if you could make it home or if you'd have to divert to a neutral country or try for a crash landing. The flight back was its own ordeal. Damaged aircraft might struggle to keep up with the formation. Wounded crew members needed first aid, sometimes serious medical intervention while still at altitude. You'd burn through your extra fuel pumping out damaged fuel tanks. The formation would thin as aircraft with critical damage dropped out, hoping their fighter escort could protect them during the lonely flight home. Crossing back over the English coast brought a flood of relief so powerful it could make grown men weep. You'd made it. Not everyone did. The empty spaces in the formation told that story, but you'd made it. The landing, sometimes on damaged gear, sometimes with wounded aboard. The debriefing where you'd report what you'd seen, where the flak was heaviest, which targets got hit. The shot of whiskey from the flight surgeon to calm your nerves. The letters you'd write to the families of crews that didn't come back. And then, a few days later, you'd do it all again. By late 1944, American bomber crews had learned to fight back against the anti-aircraft defenses that had cost so many lives. The tactics evolved through bitter experience. Fighter escorts became more aggressive, suppressing flak batteries with strafing runs before the bombers arrived. Electronic countermeasures were developed, strips of aluminum foil called chaff or window that confused German radar, making it harder for gun crews to track formations accurately. The bombers themselves flew higher and faster, with formation tactics that minimized exposure to the worst of the flak zones. American innovation extended to technology as well. The Norden bomb sight, controversial in its actual accuracy, was still accurate enough to allow high-altitude precision bombing that kept bombers above some of the lighter flak. Better weather forecasting helped mission planners avoid conditions that would force bombers down into the teeth of the defenses. The development of incendiary bombs and the shift toward area bombing of German cities, controversial even then, reflected the reality that destroying the infrastructure supporting the anti-aircraft defenses was as important as hitting the primary targets. But the most important factor was simply the courage and determination of the American bomber crews, who kept flying, kept fighting, despite losses that would have broken less determined men. They understood what was at stake. Every mission they flew, every target they destroyed, brought the war closer to its end. The oil refineries they bombed meant German tanks ran out of fuel. The factories they destroyed meant fewer weapons for German soldiers. The transportation networks they shattered meant Nazi armies couldn't be supplied or reinforced. The strategic bombing campaign was one of the most controversial aspects of World War II, and historians still debate its effectiveness and morality. But there's no debating the courage it required. American airmen faced defenses designed specifically to kill them, flew into walls of exploding steel again and again, and maintained their resolve even as the casualties mounted. They proved that American determination and innovation could overcome even the most sophisticated defenses the enemy could create. By the spring of 1945, those defenses were finally crumbling. The bombing campaign had destroyed much of Germany's industrial capacity. Fighter production was down. Fuel was critically short. The anti-aircraft batteries themselves were running low on ammunition, and many of the trained crews had been pulled away to serve as infantry in a desperate attempt to stop the Allied armies advancing from all sides. The last major flak-defended target to fall was Hitler's Eagle's Nest at Berchtesgaden, bombed by the RAF just days before the war's end. By then, American bomber crews were flying missions with minimal losses. The deadly defenses that had once seemed insurmountable finally overcome through courage, innovation, and the sheer determination to see the mission through no matter the cost. The statistics of the air war over Europe tell a story written in sacrifice. The 8th Air Force alone lost nearly 5,000 bombers and suffered over 47,000 casualties, dead, wounded, or captured. The majority of those losses came from anti-aircraft fire, from the deadly defenses that ringed every important target in Nazi-controlled Europe. These men flew into conditions that defy imagination, faced dangers that would terrify anyone, and did it because they understood that freedom required sacrifice. They were ordinary Americans, farm boys and city kids, students and mechanics, men barely out of their teens who found within themselves extraordinary courage. They faced the deadliest anti-aircraft defenses ever created, and refused to be deterred. They paid a terrible price, but their sacrifice helped break the back of Nazi Germany, destroyed the industrial capacity that fed the German war machine, and brought the war in Europe to its end. These stories remind us why courage matters, and why freedom was never free. These young men climbed into their aircraft knowing the odds were against them, knowing they might not come home, but flying anyway because their cause was just and their determination unbreakable. They proved that American courage, American innovation, and American resolve could overcome any obstacle, defeat any defense, and triumph against any enemy. Subscribe now and join us again for more untold tales of WW2, the stories of heroes who gave everything so that we might live free.